Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us on NextBillion's Spatial Insider webinar today. Today is going to be an interesting topic. We're going to talk about fixing the trouble with maps for mobility services. And I'm very honored to have Rishabh Jain here on the webinar. He's co-founder of Locale.ai. In fact, Locale and NextBillion have partnered to provide customers with a control tower that helps data-driven organizations draw operational insights from their proprietary map data. And I think the focus is on proprietary map data, as at NextBillion.ai, we do firmly believe that one map doesn't fit all to meet all the growing needs mobility services operators do have today and in the future. And in order to help them continuously optimize operations while increasing customer satisfaction and loyalty. So with that said, Rishabh, why don't you quickly introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself and also the company?
Awesome. Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me here, Armin. So I'll just start by introducing myself, right? I've been working in the location analytics space, or generally the map space, for the past 8 years now. And during this time, I got a chance to solve some very interesting problems. Everything around, how you can make decisions using location data. We worked with Ministry of Petroleum in India at my previous company, Social Corps, right? Where what we did was we helped the government plan where the next 10,000 LPG distribution centers in the country should be, right? We took a lot of data around, like public data. We took their proprietary internal data and, help them analyze and pinpoint exactly which villages to open these centers in, right? Similarly, we worked with some of the largest supply chain companies, some of the largest FMCG companies all across the world. And the problems that we were trying to were very similar, right? Like we were essentially trying to help them understand how can they match supply and demand, right? Where should they launch certain products? Where the bottlenecks in their supply chain, right? We worked with the vaccination supply chain as well, with very similar problems, right? Like how do you get vaccines to people in time while maintaining their efficacy, right? So we worked on a lot of these interesting problems around vaccines, around supply chain, etc. And that's where the idea of Locale started, right? Where we said that the job that we're doing as consultants, can we build a product out of this? Can we scale it to the whole world? Can we show the whole world how you can take maps and take the supply and demand problem and solve it without needing, very fancy tools and very fancy analysis, right? Can we make it super simple for the ops managers of today? That's how Locale started. And today we have customers about 40 different countries. And the fundamental problem that the way we like to call it is, observability for operations, right? The way something like a Datadog would help you understand your infrastructure, your online infrastructure, your cloud infrastructure. Locale would help you understand your ground infrastructure, right? Where are the gaps and how do we solve them? So yeah, that's a little bit about me. That's a little bit about Locale.
Cool. So, and obviously, again, to understand that ground infrastructure, obviously it starts with the ground truth, right?
Absolutely.
How would you, again, I think you have a lot of customers also in Europe, in particular in the micromobility space, kick scooter sharing, moped scooter companies. Where do you see kind of similarities, let's say, on things you have done before and how you can translate them into, let's say, the micromobility space?
Absolutely. Fundamentally, what we see this as, the supply and demand problem, right? Whether it's a micromobility company or it's an FMCG, right? There's a very famous quote by the founder of Nike, Phil Knight, and he says something like, supply and demand is always the root problem in business. He says that, it's hard enough to invent and manufacture a product, but then the logistics, the mechanics of getting it to people is how companies die, right? And that's what the challenge with micromobility as well is, right? It's a fundamentally amazing product. It sells on its own. But the problem that you have to solve is you have to make sure your demand and supply are always close together. You have to understand what are the demand patterns, in what areas are people going to look for them, and you have to make sure your supply is available there at the right times. As long as you ensure that, the rest of the job is taken care by your product.
Yeah, in fact, I was just attending a large festival conference this week in Hamburg called OMR 22. Some 70,000 people attending, and I think there were a couple of interesting challenges to start with when we're talking mobility now, right? It started all with, because of this pent-up demand for transportation to the fairgrounds, it was actually impossible to hail a taxi. that was one of the problems. And one other observation I had, in particular yesterday, it was a sunny day, so apparently a lot of people came to the event with a kick scooter and a moped scooter. So there were hundreds of scooters at the fairgrounds at the entrance, and several tens of car sharing cars, right? But pretty much they were idling the whole day at that location, right? While there was only business in the morning and obviously in the evening, right? And I think it's what do you do, and how do you help these operators basically to manage this time in between, again, where you have these assets idling and utilization is extremely low, and all we care about is maximizing utilization. So I think that was a very extreme problem probably, but I think that's what people dealing with every day, right?
Absolutely. And there's a very interesting story around this that we talked about, Armin, right, before this as well. Fundamentally, what you're trying to do in these kinds of cases is you're trying to increase number of trips your vehicles can take per day, right? Number of trips per vehicle per day, right? And you come across some very interesting challenges because people's behavior changes, right? One of our operators is in Amsterdam, is a very famous scooter company. And, the ops manager's problem is that, every Sunday afternoon, right? A lot of people go to the beach with taxis and with other vehicles, but while coming back, they want scooters, right? And suddenly this ops manager has to wake up on his Sunday afternoon where he wants to sleep, and he has to get up and make sure that enough scooters are available, right? And that's what our companies together are trying to solve, right? Like, you give them that proactive information. Where is the demand coming from? Where is it going to come from? Where do you have supply? And how do you make sure the right supply is available at the right locations?
Right. Obviously, Locale is let's say, at the analytics predictions kind of layer, if I may say so, right? How important is actually the underlying map, right? And maybe the way we look at these things is, we believe that, again, every business has some very specific requirements. There's a difference if, again, you're running a delivery service with a moped scooter versus the same thing with an electric van. And I think dynamics are quite different, requirements are quite different. What's your view on let's say, that underlying mapping layer?
Absolutely, that underlying mapping layer plays a very fundamental role, right? Like I talked about the beach example, right? If you don't know that that's a beach, or if you don't know there's a mall nearby, right? There's a parking lot nearby, right? Those fundamental points of interest, those fundamental, like, what are the paths to get there, right? Play a very important role, right? We have seen cases where, one of the companies we worked with, where, they estimated the time between two locations to be 20 minutes, but it was actually 5 minutes because there was a way in between, right, which only some of the local people knew, right? And unless you solve these kinds of fundamental challenges and you have the right data, it's very hard to give the right insights and the right decisions on top of it, right? So that's how the two layers bring together.
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, that's what we are seeing with our discussion with our clients also, right? They sometimes, and it is a very hyper local problem to start with.
Yeah.
And even within the country, on a city by city level, regulations may change, right? Certain vehicles may have permission on certain roads, right? A ride pooling service which is sponsored by the local transport agency might be able to drive different roads than the car, right? And I think the same applies to scooters, kick scooters in particular, pedestrian zones, bike paths versus walk paths. So there's a lot of, I think, granularity in the data to make sure, again, also compliance, to meet compliance requirements, but then ultimately provide that experience to the end user.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
so go ahead.
And around the compliance part, right? Like you mentioned a very interesting thing. Like one of the big challenges that these companies face is actually around compliance, right? Like because your scooter permits are dependent on the city council, right? So you have to give them visibility on data. You have to make sure that enough number of scooters are available in those zones that you have promised, right? And that's where this technology plays a very important role, right? The right data. And you give that visibility to your city councils that, hey, we are providing the right number of scooters here. We are saving this much environmental impact, right? Because people are using electric scooters on these lanes instead of going with, petrol cars.
Right.
So yeah, compliance and working to get very closely with city councils is actually a big part of how we work with companies today.
Let's dig a bit deeper on, let's say, some of the more operational, let's say, challenges and problems. Where do you see the majority from your experience in what operators need to focus on? Where is kind of an opportunity to, again, increase operational efficiency? So from your experience with your customers, what's your experience there?
Yeah, I think there are a few fundamental problems, right? One of them is just what we talked about earlier as well, making sure the right number of bikes are available in the right areas, right? That's your most fundamental problem. As long as you ensure that they're available in right areas, you will have higher number of trips per vehicle. That will mean that you will have higher revenue, and that will mean you'll have better economics and a better business in general, right? But then there are a lot of auxiliary problems around this to make sure this happens. Not just your vehicles need to be in the right areas at the right times, but they need to be charged, right? So there's a problem around batteries, right? How do you swap them in the most efficient way? And we've worked on multiple problems with this together, right? And we can talk more about this, right? But also problems like fare, right? Deciding fares. Now, if you know a certain zone is very low demand, right? And your scooter is not going to get utilized there. What you can do is, instead of, your users, your own ops managers going and picking up those scooters, you can incentivize your users, right? Take it here for free, and we'll pay for the ride if you take it to this location, right? And that helps the user because he's able to get a much cheaper ride, and helps the company because their scooter hopefully will get now more rides. And that's the kind of analysis that we need to enable with this technology.
Right. And obviously that's the analytical part, right? And then you have to be able to turn that into action, right? And again, it's one thing, I guess, to understand where, again, the demand is or which batteries need to be swapped in that specific case. But then how do you then actually optimize that part of the operation, again, to make sure there's maximum availability of the services, right? At minimal operational cost to it, right? And route optimization and I think use cases like that are very important there.
Absolutely. They play a very fundamental role, right? And we have seen that essentially when you're solving any of these use cases, right? With our users, there are essentially three different parts of their decision-making process, right? The first part is where you want them to get to know about something before it happens, right? Or as it's happening, right? Not like 2 hours later or next day in an Excel report, right? You want them to get an alert the moment their bikes are idling for a long time or users are not finding bikes, right? That alerts forms the first layer. Then you have to be able to go in and find out why is it happening, right? Combining the raw ground truth data and with your business data, the layer of business, you need to be able to say that I have an extra number of bikes in these areas versus I have lower number of bikes in these areas, right? Or I have these large number of batteries that I can swap much faster, right? And then taking the action part, right? Like collaborating with the right folks, making sure that you do the route optimization, right? But also you communicate that in a way that you understand what it's going to be its impact, right? So you assign that action to a person in your team saying, hey, rebalance these bikes. And that person should then be able to say that, what did rebalancing cause, right? Did it have that impact on revenue that you were expecting? Did it increase the number of trips for that vehicle, right? So this entire loop, starting with getting to know about something, figuring out why it's happening, and then being able to close the loop with a decision and an action, I think that's where these two technologies, that Spatial Locale and NextBillion, come together and make it happen.
Right. Maybe a bit more on the technical side or engineering side. Where do you see kind of the biggest challenges there in terms of, again, building these tools and scaling them, and of course globally, right? I think you have proven to do so. what's the path to make these things actually happening and working?
Yeah, I think that's sort of why a lot of us work on these problems, right? Because fundamentally, they're technically very interesting problems, right? I think one of the biggest problems is just the massive amounts of data that we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? When you have a scooter, it's probably sending you a ping every 10 seconds while it's on the move, and something like every 1 minute or 2 minutes while it's stationary, right? And that means you have a massive volume of data coming in each day, right? Now, being able to process all of that data and provide insights in real time is one of the biggest challenges, right? Because you don't want your users to get to know about something a day later, right? Next morning, when some Excel report comes and they see a cell highlighted red that, hey, you didn't have the right number of scooters here, right? You want them to get to know about it as soon as it's happening, right? And be able to do something about it, right? I think that real-timeness and the volume of data is one of the big challenges that that we constantly work on and we constantly strive to get better at.
Mm-hmm. So how are you solving these, again, massive data problems?
We have written about this a lot, and I'd encourage like everyone to check out our blogs on this. But we've built, I think, some very, very interesting technology around this, right? Combining a lot of novel tools. We have built internal libraries and internal databases that allow us to process that data in real time, right? And when you're talking about this data, you are talking about raw pings that come, right? Your scooter says, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, right? But the data by itself is not useful. You have to convert it into meaningful insights, right? Meaningful insights like in this area, right? Like you should be able to say something like, in this area of Amsterdam, over the last 6 weeks or yesterday, or 2 hours ago, what was the utilization like, right? And was that lower or higher than what it's supposed to be, right? And what actions I can drive in order to improve this utilization, right? Should I move these scooters or should I not, right?
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting other component to that also. Again, with the data which can be collected, right? There's also a possibility, obviously, to analyze travel patterns, speed patterns, right? And maybe we even discovering collectively that people are taking a route where there is no road to start with, right? And maybe it's a new build construction, right, which hasn't been mapped out. And I think collectively we can enhance then that overall experience, both for the end user, but even more importantly, I think for the operator.
Absolutely. And I think that's one very important part, right? And we have very interesting stories from our users around this, right? Like one of our users discovered that there was this very common origin destination pattern where people were constantly taking this late nights, right? It was not a college, it was not something like that. Like so we tried to understand what was happening, right? And they essentially went in, they understood that pattern, they understood the times at which happened, they understood the users, and then they were able to say, okay, this is the party area of that city, of Paris, and this is the area where a lot of college students live in, right? So now it makes sense that there are all of these late night trips happening, right? And suddenly it makes sense that, okay, where do you need to deploy scooters late at night, right? And once you understand these patterns, the way you talked about, at your conference, I think once we make these patterns more and more obvious and more and more easily ability to act upon, right? I think that's where it plays a very fundamental role, not just for the operators, but also for the users, and whose mobility hopefully we can improve, right, within their cities.
Right. I think there's two components. It's the one thing which you just described, where you can, based on the data, analyzing certain patterns, again predicting where the demand is. But then again, going back to the example from yesterday, where there's this huge event, right? And there's some road closures, right? Just during these 2 days, right? Where a car is not allowed to drive, of course, a taxi might be, or maybe not, but the scooter is, right? So enabling, I think that dynamic map layer management is also a core, I think, component to, again, improve user experience and operational efficiency.
Absolutely. I think unless you have that fundamental truth correct, right, and that ability to understand and change that, right, all of the decisions that you take on top fundamentally have a lack of accuracy, right?
Right. I'm just watching. There's some questions coming in. Well, I think we'll address them towards the end. So keep sending them. On maybe just going back a bit to our partnership again. And I think this market is about, again, as we said earlier, right? A very, very hyper local, trying to fix specific problems, where again, maybe a one size fits all solution might not be the right thing to do. So we fundamentally believe in these kind of partnerships, right, where each partner has a certain layer in the stack where that partner is focused on. Any thoughts on that from your side?
Yeah, I think it's sort of an imperative responsibility that we have as people in the ecosystem to take this forward, right? To take the ops ecosystem and the maps ecosystem forward, right? When you talk about the modern data stack, right? There are so many companies that are working so well together, right? And partnerships forms a fundamental layer of that, right? A Snowflake working very well with a BigQuery or other databases, and other tools in the ecosystem, right? So I think the partnerships is how we can take our industry forward and build more and more solutions for our users, right? And fundamentally, we have seen that the mapping industry or the geospatial industry in general has lagged behind what the industry requires it to, right? Mm-hmm. The most modern tools today are nowhere close to what we have seen in other ecosystems of data, right? So as I think these partnerships are just an endeavor to take the industry forward. And I'm sure you have some very interesting examples around this. You have been selling mapping services for the past 15 years or more, right? So I'm sure you have some very interesting stories.
Yeah, in fact, there's one interesting story which everyone on the webinar today I recommend. There's a series on Netflix called the $1 Billion Code, which is actually, and I had a couple of touch points. It's actually based on a true story, and it all goes back into the early 90s, when a small team of creatives and engineers came up with the idea to basically build a digital globe of our planet, right? And make that basically indexable and searchable. The sad part of the story is that, at some point, someone who has joined a large internet company out of the Silicon Valley apparently has copied some of the code, and there was a product turning out of this from that company then, and eventually there was a big lawsuit. That's what all the story in the movie is about. Of course, I think in the movie it's a bit accelerated, but it's interesting, how things have evolved, since the mid-90s, and we are living in an ever-changing world. Of course, I mean, we're still building things. I have just been in Dubai last week, and it's just crazy how that city grows, right? New construction areas, it becomes, delivering stuff becomes an interesting challenge also, right? And I think that's another, I think, part of our business in general, right? It's not just moving people, it's also moving pizza and parcels and petrol, like in Dubai, where everything is kind of on demand, right? And how do you find the right location for that pickup and drop off? Again, analytics play a key role to understand these details much better than maybe everyone was able 5-10 years ago.
Absolutely. I think one last part I'd add to that is, for every company that has any moving assets on the ground, there has just any assets on the ground, right? Whether you have vending machines, right? Whether you have bikes, whether you have delivery folks, there's a team of operations behind them, right? Like people who manage this day to day and people who ensure that the right things reach, there's reliability in the system, things reach on time, the costs are under control, and the company is making money. And that's almost like the job of an entrepreneur, right? And these are the folks that we want to empower with our tools, right? Like making sure they're able to take the right decisions, and have the right capabilities in order to improve the business in the city and just understand the city and understand their users.
Yeah, so maybe there have been a couple of, I think, questions both in the Q&A and in the chat. I think you're seeing them as well, right, Rishabh?
Absolutely, yes.
Maybe we address them. There's Moritz first. Actually, I know Moritz personally. Welcome, Moritz. He's asking if you look at alternative, high customized routing and navigation in off-motorway environments with real-time data that include exactly such dynamic environments. Drop me a note. Yeah, okay. We'll connect later, Moritz, on that one. One question is about I think our distance matrix API and the accuracy. Just at a high level. Here we provided at rather high performance. If that's any interest, we can certainly follow up outside the webinar. But what we do specifically is, again, we customize the map, the base map data where you then run these computations on, and it's both traffic influenced. We can integrate probe data from the client with real travel profiles, speed profiles in real world for that specific use case. So we have several capabilities there to help again provide a very custom solution. There is one question on the Q&A. Maybe you want to answer that one, Rishabh. Are there any other players in the market taking a different approach to the future of the maps for mobility, or is this the widely accepted direction?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I think there are a few different approaches. I think one of the approaches is around building the core algorithms and giving it to the user, right? Which is, hey, you tell the user that this is exactly what the algorithm tells the user, this is exactly what you should do, right? And there's one approach where you give them a control tower to analyze and be able to take their own decisions, right? You build a SOP around it, but you let them take your own decisions, right? We fundamentally believe that these algorithms these decisions form a very competitive layer for each of these operators, right? So their business is just sort of understood by the quality of decisions that their ops teams are making, right? And your algorithms might not always be able to account for that, right? So we have seen that one approach is giving those direct algorithms to tell people this is how many scooters you should have here, this is how many number of people you need to move this, things like that, right? Versus there's an approach where you give them the access to the right data, you give them the right ability to make decisions, but you don't make it for those users, right? You combine your intelligence or your platform's intelligence with the inherent knowledge that these ops users have, right? I think that the latter is what we are going with, but I think there's some very interesting approaches around just giving the algorithms directly to the users.
Right. So there's one more question. How is quality of map data compared to OSM? Well, the answer here is, from a platform point of view, as NextBillion, we are actually map agnostic, map data agnostic. So we do work with OSM as a base layer, but we can also process and ingest data from commercial providers. We have customers who have maybe already a commercial relationship with again a commercial provider. So our focus is really on providing the APIs and for the different again products and use cases we do support with best of class ETAs and predictions, and we can choose again different map data suppliers in different parts of the world also to make sure we always do the best breed. We have customers actually where we built the base layer map to start with to make it routable. We have a customer in the ride-hailing business who does that with us, when they basically launch in new cities where they have figured out, the generally available map data is not good enough. So we help them even build the base layer. So it depends on our engagement. And of course, then I think we can expose all that data to the tools Locale does, and basically you can make those decisions on your own operational mapping layer, and again take actions based on your analysis also then on that same layer. So we have, that helps, I think, everyone to have a much more coherent and consistent user experience. Good. One other question, maybe you take this one. What are the benefits from NextBillion and Locale.ai partnerships to a customer?
Yeah, I think, Shraddha, to answer your question, just getting the accurate data from NextBillion, right? Being able to customize the data and change the fundamental map data based on your understanding of the city, right? And then using that data, adding a business layer on top of that map data, right? Where are you getting trips from? Where is demand coming from? Where is supply idle, right? I think combining these two layers is where you get a lot of value out of as an operator in the mobility or delivery or any of these spaces, right? So I think that's where this partnership, I think, comes very together, where we have a lot of API integrations which allow us to talk to each other's platforms, right? And bring in accurate map data from NextBillion and allow the insights from Locale to be acted upon with the algorithms that NextBillion has.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, it's not just the map of a city, it's actually the map unique to that customer's operation. As I mentioned earlier, right? I mean, travel times in a van in London are different than on an e-bike, right? And understanding these patterns and the types of vehicles being used, and then help optimize the operation with that dedicated data set, again, makes a difference to that specific operation. Whereas maybe, I mean, again, the general traffic of cars doesn't have an impact on that bike on the bike lane, really, right? So you want to make sure that all your optimization, all your routing, all your ETA prediction is very customer and vehicle specific, and then build the analytics on top, and then optimize basically further from there. If that makes sense. Okay. Well, I think we are slowly but surely approaching the end. If there's no more questions, maybe Rishabh, some maybe final remarks from your side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think fundamentally, I'm just very excited to have this partnership together, right? Where hopefully we can take the entire industry forward and create a lot of value for operators in mobility, in delivery spaces, right? And I think especially with things like COVID, right? People have understood the value of having access to the right data, right? Versus relying on just intuition, right? Because so many things change so dynamically, as we saw with the situation over the past 2 years, right? So I think that being able to bring in the right data, being able to take the right decisions is what will separate the companies that win from the rest of them.
Cool. Then with that, maybe just one final remark from my side. Those who joined here from Europe, we have an important event coming up in a few weeks, Micromobility Europe in Amsterdam. Our two companies will be present there. So anyone who wants to have a follow-up discussion and happens to visit there, I think it's going to be an exciting, interesting event. Again, post-COVID now, we're all getting better, getting back together at conferences, which just makes such a big difference in conducting business and building the network. So with that, thanks everyone for joining today. Hopefully this was insightful and useful, and happy to keep the conversation going, after the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.